Guys, so I'm going to share my screen with you. Oh, look, that's a lovely picture of me. Let's see. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about journalism. So I had you read about journalism and answer the questions before. So there's no activity for today. I will put a couple questions on forum for you to engage with, but the way I see it, you've pretty much already done your activity. But I do want to go ahead and go through some elements of journalism, just because this is an area that some of you may choose to pursue in the future. So I think it's important that we go through it. So the first question is, what is news? That's a good one. And news basically is what's happened, what's new. That's the idea of news. And that can include the predictable. So things that we know are coming, like you know, a couple days ago there was a presidential primary, so that's predictable, we knew, but also the extraordinary. So for example, during times like these, you hear a lot of amazing stories of people doing fantastic things, and so all of that is news. So whatever's new, that's news. So right now there's a lot of emphasis on negative news. If you put on any form of media, the television, the radio, I've been listening to NPR a lot. I've been going to the NPR app and then looking at other news apps as well. Also, Facebook, Instagram, social media, there's a lot of bad news right now. And you know, the media gets criticized quite a bit for dwelling in bad news. And you know, because those are the things that are usually extraordinary or that captivate people. And there's a push, of course, to also focus on good news and to try to share good news. And so hopefully you'll see people in all forms of media right now trying to share good news as well. That's something I've been trying to do on social media because there's plenty of bad news to go around. So I've been trying to share some good news every day for my connections. But that is definitely a topic of conversation with the media, is the balance of positive and negative news. Certainly we have to have negative news. So we need to know what's going on. For example, right now with coronavirus, I mean, it's important that we know what's going on, that we understand the severity of this. And, you know, there's a lot to be said to you know, to criticize how the coronavirus was downplayed and treated differently in different media outlets at the beginning of this. But it's also important right now that we find some positive news too, the ways that people are helping each other, or, you know, local initiatives. Right now in Greenville, there's a local initiative for, I can't exactly remember what it's called, basically like Takeout Wednesday, that, which we had yesterday, where everybody was encouraged to get takeout from some local restaurant, or even if it's a chain, and just to tip well too. So you know, the news goes in cycles in terms of negative and positive, but that's certainly a conversation that will continue as we, you know, go forth. Pseudo events are also news, and pseudo events, the name is kind of deceiving. It's not that they are fake events, but they are events that are really manipulated or planned. Like a press conference is considered a pseudo event. It's an event that has been constructed in a certain way. A rally is a pseudo event because it's been constructed for a purpose. So, but those are still news, and those tend to dominate our news, honestly. And it's also, when we talk about the news, it's impossible not to talk about soft new days and agenda setting. So soft new days are when there's just not a lot of big news going on. So like no time lately. But, and so news media have to kind of concoct some news or go back and find a story that they've done on a local business, for example, and just plug it in. And then agenda setting is the concept that the news really, the selection of what stories are discussed on the news really does set the agenda for the viewers. So, so what is news? It's, gosh, anything that's new. All right, so the history of journalism. So we started really with a penny press, and the penny press was very simple in terms of media, at least as we think of it today with how complex we've gotten. It's called the penny press because, you guessed it, it cost a penny. But also, interestingly, there was very little initially manipulation with the penny press. You would get your newsletter or newspaper, and all of the news would be in it chronologically. Okay, today when we see printed media, the most important things, or what the outlet wants us to think is the most important, is right in the front. It's like breaking news. I swear, every 24-hour news channel has breaking news all day long, and half the time it's not in fact breaking. It's just news, but it gets your attention. Breaking news, and we all pay attention. In print media, it's whatever the biggest story is on the front. It's the big picture, it's the font is huge, right? But with the penny press, it was just the news chronologically as it happened. Now that did become a little more sensational as time went on to try to get people to buy the news. So looking for stories that were a little more sensational or lascivious, or, you know, sometimes adding a little bit in there. And then there was also an editorial section in the penny press. What's interesting about that, though, is that it was very clearly called an editorial section. And many newspapers still have an editorial section today, or a magazine will have a letter to the editor. But a lot of our televised media outlets have a lot of editorial without calling it that. They just call it the news. Now, in the time of the penny press as well, it's important to point out the minority newspapers. And these are important. This would include the Cherokee had a newspaper of their own. The North Star by Frederick Douglass, which was his abolitionist newspaper that was, it was modeled on The Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison. That was an important minority newspaper. There were Latino newspapers as well in the early days of print. And so these were papers that are really important in order to get culturally relevant news in front of people. Then we move on to the Associated Press in 1946. The Associated Press, even today, is known for their objectivity. If you want non-biased reporting, the Associated Press is a great place to go. And if I remember correctly, I'm pretty sure it was Matthew who pointed this out at the beginning of the semester. Was it Matthew? If it was, good for you. I'm pretty sure it was. So the Associated Press holds up several pillars of journalism. Objectivity, which means no bias. They're just trying to give you the information as it is. Truth and accuracy. So they're going to give you the information, and it's going to be as accurate as possible. Integrity, which means that they're getting their own information using reliable sources as well, and sticking to these principles. And then ethics, which is both in terms of originality and in honesty and factualization. Sensational journalism. Well, wasn't this a fine time? So sensational journalism really started in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So I guess technically this is before the Associated Press. But this gives you, doing it in this order, gives you a little bit of the idea of why the Associated Press was so needed. So sensational journalism really started with Joseph Pulitzer. And this is funny, you might think, because the Pulitzer Prize is one of the highest prizes in the written word. And so how could this be named after someone who's known for sensational journalism? I'm so glad you asked. So Joseph Pulitzer was actually born in Europe, and he immigrated to the United States. And when he did, he began purchasing up newspapers across the country. And he eventually settled really on focusing on the New York World. And in the World, he reported the news, but with very sensational kind of frame to it. And he was known for this, and people knew. But it gave him a lot of power because he really controlled a lot of the narrative. Interestingly, he's also responsible for the first color comics in Sunday newspapers. So when I was a kid, I loved reading the comics in the Sunday newspaper. I was totally that kid. I loved Garfield, Family Circle, Beetle Bailey, Hagar the Horrible. Oh my goodness, how I loved the cartoons. I don't know if any of you read those when you were a kid, but you know, right now, you might as well pull out your Sunday paper on Sunday and read the comics. It'll make you feel good. So I suggest it. But so Joseph Pulitzer, based on one of those comics, actually a character in the comics, what's coined the phrase yellow journalism. And yellow journalism was really this whole idea of sensationalizing the news. And he did that for most of his career. Also a yellow journalist, William Randolph Hearst. And a couple of you mentioned him when you watched Citizen Kane for your film analysis. But William Randolph Hearst was another yellow journalist. The San Francisco Chronicle, I think, pretty sure is the name of his major newspaper. But he was another one who, there's just a lot of exaggeration in the news. And muckrakers eventually came in and started exposing all of this. And as for Pulitzer in 1898, after the war, he turned more to investigative stories, and he really switched to public service journalism and education in journalism. And that's why the Pulitzer Prize is named after him. By the way, the Associated Press has one of over 50 Pulitzer Prizes, which is kind of a big deal. And a good chunk of those are for photographs. I digress. William Randolph Hearst also at the end of his life put a lot of money into educating people about journalism and communications. But both of them, particularly Hearst, was kind of a controversial figure in journalism. He also was incredibly wealthy, and he owned a house in California, San Simeon, I think. San Simeon? Anyway, it's like a castle. Hearst Castle is what it's also referred to. And dang, y'all, you should Google it. I do want to show you a clip from Citizen Kane. And this scene takes place when Kane is creating his Declaration of Principles. So the Declaration of Principles, I'm going to turn the volume up. I don't know how this is going to work for you, so sorry if it starts screaming at you. The Declaration of Principles is what Kane decides to follow when he establishes his newspaper. And so it's everything that's important about running a newspaper. So take a look. Notice his face is in shadow, because this doesn't last. And it does, because he does not end up standing by those principles. So, but it goes to show that even, you know, and his character is based on William Randolph Hearst, but this idea that, you know, you can, you set up your principles, and in journalism, those are really important, but are sometimes not stuck to when things get out of hand and when money is coming and political interests are coming. And so it's part of that overall storyline, but also I think that movie is such a fantastic commentary on journalism and the development of journalism. And as a journalism student or communication student, you really, really should watch it. All righty, moving on. All right, so convergence. So print media started going a little bit downhill with the rise of radio, because then we could get our news anytime, turn on the radio and there it would be. And then even more so with television. And so when television news started, It wasn't on 24 hours a day like it is now. Television news was at certain times of the day. And like with print journalism, there's a lot of discussion about the principles and the ethics of television journalism. And a very important part of that conversation was a man named Edward R. Murrow, who was really indicative of the golden age of television news. And he, in particular, was determined to maintain truth, particularly during the trials of with Senator Joseph McCarthy. So there's a movie that's been made about him. It's called Good Night and Good Luck. I'm going to show you the trailer, and then I'm going to show you a little bit of the real Edward R. Murrow. But this movie's called Good Night and Good Luck. It's another one that I really think is required viewing for communications majors, but take a look. All right, and then let me show you just a clip as well of Good Will Hunting, great film. Oh, look, there's several really good movies on here, but I'm getting distracted. All right, so here's an actual clip of Murrow on McCarthy. All right, there you go. Okay, so the point of that is just to point out that, you know, a question becomes, what are the responsibilities of journalists? Are the responsibilities to report? Are the responsibilities to expose? What are the responsibilities? And as you could see from those clips, in that particular instance, it became a very tricky and sticky thing for journalism. Now, since then, we've turned to the 24-hour news channel. Woo, heavens, which creates what's called a news hole. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, most of the time, a lot of news isn't happening. And so the question then becomes, how do you fill it? How do you fill a 24-hour news cycle? Do you repeat the news? Do you pull out stock footage that you have? Or do you bring attention to something that doesn't need attention brought to it? Or do you pick something and then just run with it? An example I think of from the more early-ish days of the 24-hour news cycle that that really shows the power of the 24-hour news cycle was when Natalee Holloway disappeared. So Natalee Holloway was a young woman, lovely, gosh, how old was she? Early 20s, blonde. She was in Aruba and she disappeared. And we realize now she was murdered, and we pretty much know who murdered her, but she was just missing. She was missing on an island. And the news got a hold of this, and they ran Natalee Holloway stories nearly 24 hours a day. It was the huge news item. And not to say that it's not important that a young woman had disappeared, because it is, but it was an intriguing time in analyzing media because they chose her. Why her? There are people who go disappearing every day. Is it because she was white, blonde, and very wealthy? Is it because it was just a slow news day and someone grabbed a hold of it, right? People go missing all the time. We see them, their faces on billboards and passed around social media. Tragedies happen all the time, but the media grabbed hold of Natalee Holloway and just ran with it. Nancy Grace, who was on, gosh, what was she, CNN maybe? She was really the biggie in terms of getting this name out there. And when someone's missing, you should get their name out there. But it raised a lot of questions of, why are we getting her name out there and not others? There was an African-American girl who disappeared around the same time. Why not her name? Why Natalee Holloway? What does she represent to us? So that's something that's probably worth your time looking into as well. Natalee Holloway, or even can't think of her name. Both of these would make great research paper topics. The coverage of Natalee Holloway, or JonBenet Ramsey is another one. The little girl who was a pageant toddler in Tierra who was murdered. So yeah, think about that one. Okay, Foundations of Journalism, a free and responsible press, which was a written statement claiming that the public has a right to information and that the press has a moral obligation to provide it. So that's an interesting way of discussing journalism, that the public has the right to know all these things. And as a member of the press, is it your moral obligation to provide it? Is it your obligation to provide it? The separation of news and business operations is also an interesting topic in terms of journalism. It's sort of like separation of church and state, the idea that the news should present the news regardless of where the money is coming from or people trying to buy their way into the news. Fair and balanced in terms of news, also important. How are we fair to both sides? How are we balanced? And we talked at the beginning of the semester about how Fox News, their tagline used to be fair and balanced, and they've kind of gotten away from that in recent years as they've admittedly become more lopsided. Same with MSNBC. It doesn't purport to be fair or balanced. It's very left. Framing, which we've mentioned a little bit already. The issue with framing is that it really paints over the complexity of a situation. But nonetheless, most items of news are framed a certain way. And then sources. And this is really important because it has to do with representation. So who are the expert sources? When we're talking about immigration issues in the news, who are the expert sources? Are they people who are associated with the experience of being an immigrant? Are they people who have studied long and hard immigration? Or are they talking heads for different organizations? If you're doing a story on the struggles of Latina Americans, who are the experts? Are they Latina Americans, or are they people who have researched this life but never really lived it? So there are definitely some issues with representation in the news today. We report on certain cultures or certain groups of people without going to those people themselves. And that's certainly an issue. I was thinking about all of this actually recently too, in terms of fake news and how we determine what's fake news. And I've about had it with Facebook. So I've been on Facebook a lot since this the pandemic broke out, just checking on people and seeing if anyone needs things, and also just distraction. And the other day I was on Facebook, and within the course of about 24 hours, I saw 5 people repost a post from a guy telling the story about how there was this incident on an airplane and only Fox News reported it, and there were a group of Middle Eastern men on the plane, and there was a confrontation and some really terrible things were said by these men and threats were made, and how the whole world's distracted by coronavirus when we have this threat from, as they've called it, radical Islam. And I saw that, and my fake news, beep, 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 like, oh, it went off. And so I look it up on Snopes immediately. And this is a story that actually first went around social media in 2009 and was debunked immediately because it did not happen that way at all. And here it was in 2020, back on social media, being shared by multiple people with whom I'm connected. So I can only imagine how many places it was shared, as if this had just happened. And there it is, folks. It's an election year. We're in a high stress time with coronavirus. It's the time to be vigilant about fake news and to have conversations about fake news and those who purport it to be true. So that's just something to keep in mind. Finally, types of journalism. Interpretive reporting, which is reporting of an event with a broader context. And a subset of this would be new journalism, which came about in the 1960s and 70s, which was really using a lot of literary techniques in writing journalism. So Truman Capote is a great example of a new journalist. If you've not read In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, you really should read that. Also, fun fact, if you've read To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, the character Dill, her little friend, is based on Truman Capote because he was friends with Harper Lee. Norman Mailer is also an excellent example of new journalism, and a book that you could read by him that would be a good example, and is a fantastic book. It's called The Executioner's Song. That book really deeply affected me. So those are a couple books you might want to check out in terms of new journalism. In Cold Blood really is the beginning of a genre called, oh my goodness, true fiction. I think true fiction is what it's called, but it's written like fiction, but it's true, but some of it's, I mean, the dialogue's made up, and it's interesting. But anyway, so that and The Executioner's Song, great books. Alternative journalism, which is more like radical newspapers or sort of fringe newspapers. Public journalism, citizen journalism, which we've talked about a little bit in class with all the citizen journalists running around with their phones. And then constructive journalism, which, like interpretive reporting, uses a broader context, but it uses it to try to repair something. And then, of course, we have this convergence of digital journalism, which is when I meant to tell the story of what I just saw on Facebook. But this idea that now we're getting a lot of news from digitally, both from news sites, but also from social media, and the dangers of that, and how that's really led to the fake news. I don't even know a word to use to describe it. But it also allows, of course, other parties, foreign or domestic, to interfere with our news by injecting false news into social media. And as well as I, once you put something into social media, it's like a wildfire. So these are some things you should think about with journalism. I'm going to put a couple questions on the forum for you to discuss, but there's no activity for this one because I'm just going to use your questions that you did before we left as the activity for this. So I'm excited to see what comments you have, and feel free to start a discussion yourself on the forum too if you want to talk about this stuff, because there's certainly a lot to elaborate on here. So that's enough for today. Hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day. And then next time we meet, we're going to talk about public relations, and that should be fun. All right. I will see you guys later. Have a great rest of your day. See ya.